You know, sometimes I think I hold the unofficial world record for most ridiculous HOA confrontation leading to a felony conviction. Drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me if you've ever heard a crazier story than the one I'm about to lay on you. It all started, as these things often do, with a power trip of epic proportions, personified by one Miss Prosons, Agnes Periwinkle, our HOA president, or, as she preferred to be called, the steward of community standards. I just called her Karen, though never to her face, at least not until the very end. This particular saga culminated in her frantically demanding a special forces team and an airlift because her self-proclaimed HOA master key wouldn't grant her access to my private residence, all while my own son, bless his patient soul, was the 911 dispatcher on the other end of the line, initially trying to navigate the call with the professional equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Little did she know, her meltdown wasn't just being recorded, it was being managed, in a way, by someone who knew exactly what kind of hornet's nest she was. And let me tell you, the hornets were about to get very, very real for Agnes. It all began, as these suburban nightmares often do, rather innocuously. Our previous HOA president, a kindly old gentleman named Mr. Poplus, rather innocuously. Henderson, who mostly concerned himself with the annual petunia contest and ensuring the Christmas lights weren't too garish, decided to retire and move closer to his grandkids. His departure left a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped Agnes Periwinkle, a woman whose primary qualification seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of righteous indignation and a belief that the neighborhood covenants were sacred texts penned by the archangels themselves. She was, to put it mildly, a piece of work. Early on, I remember her campaign, if you could call it that. It mostly consisted of going door to door, not to solicit votes, but to point out minor infractions. Your azaleas are encroaching 1 inch onto the common path, Mr. Smith, she'd say, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for repeat offenders in a maximum security prison. She drove a pristine pearl-white Lexus SUV, the kind that always seemed freshly detailed, and her outfits were a study in expensive but somehow joyless conformity, stiffly ironed blouses, sharply creased slacks, and sensible heels that nonetheless clicked with an alarming authority on the pavement. Her hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed silver, unyielding to wind or reason. I'm an engineer by trade, semi-retired now, but I spent 40 years designing and implementing secure access systems for various facilities, some of them quite sensitive. My mind naturally gravitates towards logic, regulations, and the clear delineation of rights and responsibilities. So, when Agnes was elected, a term I use loosely, as the turnout was abysmal and most of us just wanted someone, anyone, to fill the role so we could get back to our lives, I figured, okay, a bit of a busybody, but we'll manage. I've dealt with far more challenging personalities in corporate boardrooms. How wrong I was. Her first few months were a flurry of new rules, amendments to bylaws, and increasingly stringent interpretations of existing guidelines. The community newsletter, once a cheerful roundup of birthdays and bake sales, became a grim litany of violations and warnings. Lawn gnomes were declared aesthetically disruptive. Wind chimes were noise pollution. The approved palette for exterior paint was narrowed down to 3 equally uninspiring shades of beige. My neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, who'd lived in her house for 50 years and whose prize-winning roses were the highlight of the street, received a formal citation because some petals had allegedly fallen onto the sidewalk in a disorderly fashion. It was madness, but a creeping, insidious kind of madness that most people just grumbled about and complied with to avoid the hassle. The master key policy was unveiled about 6 months into her reign of terror. It was presented at a sparsely attended Tuesday night HOA meeting, tucked away in the new business section of the agenda. Agnes stood at the rickety podium in our community clubhouse, beaming as if she'd just solved world hunger. For the safety and security of our community, she announced, her voice resonating with self-importance, and to allow for emergency access and routine maintenance inspections as deemed necessary by the board, but these for deemed due access and due access. The HOA will be procuring a master key system for all residences. A stunned silence fell over the room. Even her usual enablers on the board looked a little uneasy. Someone, I think it was Tom Henderson, a mild-mannered accountant from down the street, finally piped up, "Agnes, you mean a key that can open all our front doors?" She smiled patronizingly. "Precisely, Mr. Henderson, for efficiency and adherence to community standards. Of course, its use will be strictly regulated." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just overreach, this was a flagrant disregard for privacy, security, and basic property rights. I designed systems to prevent unauthorized access, not facilitate it at the whim of a self-appointed guardian. I raised my hand. "Miss Periwinkle," I began, keeping my voice as neutral as I could you please cite the specific article in our covenants, or any relevant state or local laws that grant the HOA the authority to possess a master key to private residences?" She blinked, her smile faltering for a microsecond. "It's an initiative for community betterment, Mr. Davies, a proactive measure. With all due respect," I continued, "proactive measures still need to be legal. Forcing homeowners to provide access to their homes in this manner, without individual consent or a clear, legally defined emergency, sounds highly problematic. What locksmith would even agree to create such a system for an HOA without individual homeowner authorizations? I knew a bit about locksmithing ethics and laws. What she was proposing was a minefield. Her face tightened. The pearl-white Lexus of her demeanor was showing a scratch. "The board has approved this," she snapped, gesturing vaguely at the two other board members who were now intently studying their shoelaces. "It's for everyone's good." The discussion, if you could call it that, went downhill from there. I calmly pointed out the legal ramifications, the security risks, what if that key was lost or stolen, and the sheer audacity of the proposal. She, in turn, accused me of being uncooperative, disruptive, and not a team player. The motion, of course, passed, though I suspected the votes were more about avoiding her wrath than genuine agreement. I went home that night fuming, but also with a cold sense of determination. This wasn't about lawn gnomes anymore. This was a line. I immediately started researching Virginia state law regarding landlord-tenant rights. Even though we were homeowners, the access principles were similar: trespass laws and HOA powers. Unsurprisingly, there was absolutely nothing that supported her master key initiative. In fact, most legal precedents leaned heavily towards protecting the sanctity of a private dwelling. I drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA board, citing the relevant statutes and legal opinions, and formally stated that I would not be complying with any request to provide a key to my home, nor would I permit any unauthorized alteration to my locks to accommodate such a system. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. I also started upgrading my home security, new deadbolts, the kind that couldn't be easily master keyed by any standard method she might try to bully a local locksmith into, and a couple of discreet, high-resolution security cameras covering my front porch and entryway. I had a feeling things were going to escalate, and if there's one thing my career taught me, it's the value of good documentation and irrefutable evidence. My son, Mark, who was already working as a 911 dispatcher, thought I was being a bit paranoid at first, but he knew my professional background. "Just be careful, Dad," he'd said. "People like that can be unpredictable when their power is challenged." He had no idea how right he was, or how directly he'd eventually be involved. The HOA's response to my letter was a curt, dismissive note stating the Master Key program was proceeding as planned for the benefit of all residents. Agnes Periwinkle, it seemed, was not accustomed to being told no, and I, it seemed, was about to become her public enemy number one. The stage was set for a showdown, and I was methodically preparing for it, not realizing it would play out in a way neither of us could have ever predicted. The weeks following my formal refusal to participate in Agnes Periwinkle's Master Key initiative were characterized by a steady escalation of petty harassments. It was as if, by challenging her authority on that one significant issue, I had painted a giant target on my back for every conceivable minor infraction, real or imagined. My meticulously kept lawn, once a source of quiet pride, suddenly became a battleground. One week, I received a violation notice because my grass was allegedly a quarter of an inch too high, according to some newly minted HOA ruler she must have personally calibrated. The next, a different notice claimed my edging wasn't crisp enough, accompanied by a blurry photograph that looked like it had been taken during an earthquake. I responded to each with calm, factual letters, complete with dated photographs, and, in the case of the grass height, a notarized statement from my lawn care service confirming compliance. It was exhausting, like swatting at a swarm of persistent, buzzing flies. But I knew giving in on the small things would only embolden her. Agnes, in her pearl-white Lexus, would often cruise slowly past my house, her gaze lingering a little too long, her expression a mixture of disapproval and something I could only describe as predatory anticipation. It was clear she was waiting for me to slip up, to give her an excuse for something more. The other neighbors were a mixed bag. Some, like old Mrs. Gable, were quietly supportive, offering whispered words of encouragement when they thought Agnes wasn't looking. Mrs. Gable had even started leaving little anonymous notes of solidarity in my mailbox, a pressed flower, a newspaper clipping about a particularly egregious HOA overreach in another state. Others, cowed by Agnes's aggressive enforcement, kept their distance, afraid of becoming her next target. The HOA board, apart from Agnes, consisted of two other individuals. A nervous man named Arthur Jenkins, who seemed perpetually terrified of his own shadow, and a woman named Brenda Riley, who appeared to be Agnes's primary sycophant, nodding vigorously at everything Agnes said and echoing her sentiments with an enthusiasm that bordered on alarming. They were classic enablers, either too weak or too self-interested to challenge Agnes's increasingly autocratic behavior. I tried reasoning with Arthur once, catching him as he was retrieving his mail. "Arthur," I said gently, "this master key idea, it's not just a bad idea, it's legally indefensible. You're exposing the HOA and yourselves as board members to significant liability." He paled, stammered something about Agnes has done her research, and practically sprinted back into his house. It was clear that logic and reason were not going to penetrate the wall of fear and delusion Agnes had constructed around her little fiefdom. My son Mark would call me every few days to check in. "How's the HOA war going, Dad?" he'd ask, a note of amusement in his voice that was gradually being replaced by concern. I'd fill him in on the latest absurdity, and he'd just sigh. "She sounds like a real piece of work. You sure you don't want to just move to a condo downtown?" I'd laugh. "And admit defeat? Never. Besides, I like my house, my garden, and frankly, Mark, it's the principle of the thing. This isn't her personal kingdom." I continued to meticulously document everything, every notice, every letter, every slow drive by from Agnes. My security cameras, originally installed with the master key issue in mind, were now capturing a wealth of footage of Agnes's peculiar habits, including one memorable instance where she was caught on camera attempting to measure the height of my mailbox with a tape measure, her face contorted in concentration. It would have been comical if it wasn't so unnerving. I also made a point of reviewing our HOA covenants and bylaws with a fine-tooth comb, cross-referencing them with state and local ordinances. I wanted to be absolutely certain of my rights and her limitations. Knowledge, as they say, is power, and I was arming myself with as much of it as possible. The Master Key Project, despite my objections and, I suspected, the quiet unease of many other residents, seemed to be inching forward. Rumors circulated that Agnes had found a locksmith from out of town, someone less scrupulous or perhaps just ignorant of the full implications, who was willing to undertake the work. She started sending out notices scheduling voluntary lock inspection and upgrade appointments. The word voluntary was clearly a misnomer, as the notices were followed by increasingly threatening letters implying dire consequences for non-compliance, including fines and even hints of legal action, though on what grounds she never specified. I, of course, ignored these notices, having already made my position crystal clear. This only seemed to infuriate Agnes further. The pettiness ramped up. One morning, I found a small, almost imperceptible scratch on my car door. The next day, my newspaper was missing. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in the context of Agnes's escalating campaign, it felt like a deliberate, childish provocation. I reported the scratch to the police, more for documentation than any expectation they'd find the culprit, and installed another camera with a view of my driveway. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. You could feel it in the stiff nods instead of friendly waves, the hurried conversations that ended abruptly when Agnes's Lexus hove into view. It was a classic case of a bully holding an entire community hostage through intimidation and the abuse of a minor position of authority. I knew a confrontation was inevitable. I just didn't know when or how it would manifest. I made sure my legal paperwork was in order, my evidence meticulously catalogued, and my resolve unshaken. I even had a quiet chat with a lawyer friend who specialized in property disputes. He reviewed my documentation and Agnes's master key proposal and just whistled. "She's so far out of bounds, it's not even funny," he said. "If she tries to force entry or retaliate against you for refusing, you'll have her dead to rights. Keep those cameras rolling." That was the plan. I felt like I was living in a slow-motion siege, waiting for the inevitable assault. And then, one bright Tuesday morning, it happened. I was in my home office working on a design for a small consultancy project I'd taken on when I heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of a key fumbling in my front door lock. My heart rate kicked up a notch. The moment, it seemed, had arrived. I walked quietly to my front window, peering through a gap in the blinds, and there she was. Agnes Periwinkle, resplendent in a canary yellow pantsuit that did her no favors, her silver helmet of hair gleaming in the sun. In her hand, she held a single shiny key attached to an oversized plastic tag labeled HOA Master, Sector 1. She was jiggling it in my deadbolt, a look of intense concentration mixed with smug entitlement on her face. My deadbolt, of course, was a high-security, non-standard model I'd installed precisely to prevent this kind of nonsense. Her master key, whatever its origin, was never going to open it. I could see the frustration mounting on her face as the key refused to turn. She tried it upside down. She jiggled it more forcefully. She even gave the door a little push, as if that would magically make the tumblers align. My security camera, strategically positioned above the door, was capturing every moment in glorious high definition. I almost felt a twinge of pity for her almost. But then I remembered the months of harassment, the stress she'd caused Mrs. Gable, the general atmosphere of oppression she'd cultivated. No, any pity evaporated quickly, replaced by a cold, almost clinical interest in how this was going to play out. After another minute of fruitless effort, she stepped back, huffing, and pulled out her phone. I saw her dial, her lips moving angrily. I had a very, very good idea who she was calling. My son, Mark, was on duty at the county's 911 dispatch center that morning. This was about to get interesting. I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, of course, but I could imagine it. Her voice, usually so commanding when addressing us mere residents, would likely be a carefully modulated blend of authority and feigned distress when speaking to emergency services. I pictured Mark recognizing the address, maybe even her voice if she was a frequent flyer for petty complaints, trying to maintain his professional composure. A few minutes passed. Agnes was now pacing on my porch, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing emphatically. Then I saw her demeanor shift. She looked up at my house, then back at her phone, a flicker of something, confusion, annoyance, crossing her face. This, I guessed, was Mark employing his initial strategy. Professional delay. He'd be asking clarifying questions, verifying details, perhaps putting her on hold to consult with a supervisor or check officer availability in her sector. Anything to slow her roll and subtly highlight the absurdity of calling 911 because her non-existent authority wasn't being recognized by my door lock. I could almost hear him. "Ma'am, can you spell the name Periwinkle for me again? And you're saying your key, an HOA master key, isn't working on a private residence? Is the resident home? Are they in distress? Are you in distress?" Each question, perfectly reasonable from a dispatcher's perspective, would be like a tiny pinprick to Agnes's inflated ego. Her pacing became more agitated. She was talking rapidly now, her gestures becoming wilder. I saw her point at my door, then stab a finger towards the sky, then clutch her chest theatrically. This was the escalation phase. Whatever Mark was saying, or not saying, was clearly not giving her the instant gratification she expected. She wasn't getting the immediate deployment of a SWAT team to enforce her will. Then, through my closed window, I started to hear fragments of her side of the conversation, her voice rising in pitch and volume. Absolutely outrageous. Uncooperative and possibly dangerous individual. I am the HOA president. I demand access. He could be doing anything in there. This is a serious security risk." Her voice was cracking with indignation. I had to admire Mark's restraint if he was managing to keep a straight face through this. He knew me. He knew I was probably in my slippers, drinking coffee, and wondering if I should prune the roses later. The idea of me being a dangerous individual was frankly hilarious. But Agnes wasn't laughing. She was working herself into a full-blown Karen meltdown. And then came the kicker. I heard her practically shriek into the phone, "No, you don't understand. This man, Davies, he's unhinged. I fear for my safety. I fear for the community he's barricaded himself in. I think I might need an airlift. Yes, an airlift and special forces. He's really, really dangerous, I tell you. He could have weapons. You need to send everyone, now!" My jaw, which had been set in grim amusement, nearly hit the floor. An airlift? Special forces? She'd gone from a thwarted busybody to casting me as the villain in a Tom Clancy novel. This was no longer just a case of HOA overreach. This was a malicious, fantastical accusation being made to emergency services. I saw her hang up the phone, a look of grim triumph on her face, as if she'd just single-handedly averted a national crisis. She smoothed down her canary yellow pantsuit, puffed out her chest, and stood there, expectantly, like a Roman emperor awaiting a victorious legion. Little did she know, the legion she'd summoned, based on her own hysterical fabrications, was indeed on its way. And it was going to be far more than she bargained for, in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The initial, subtle trolling phase from Mark's end was clearly over. Agnes had, in her infinite arrogance, just written a check her credibility couldn't cash, and the dispatcher on the other end, my son, was now professionally obligated to respond to the severity of her claims, however ludicrous they seemed to anyone who actually knew me. The distant thrum of a helicopter was just beginning to register in the quiet morning air. The subtle thrumming in the distance grew steadily louder, resolving itself into the unmistakable chop-chop-chop of a helicopter. Agnes Periwinkle, still standing sentinel on my porch, actually preened, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She probably imagined it was the advance scout for her special forces, coming to liberate the neighborhood from the dangerous barricaded in Mr. Davies. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. She'd really done it. She'd escalated her petty tyranny to the point of summoning a full-scale emergency response based on utter fantasy. Through the window, I saw the first police cruiser turn onto our street, lights flashing but siren off, a respectful approach for a potentially dangerous situation. Then another, and another. Within minutes, our quiet suburban cul-de-sac looked like a scene from a disaster movie. 2 fire trucks rumbled to a halt, their bulk seeming to fill the entire street. An ambulance, its crew looking bewildered, parked a little further down. And overhead, the news helicopter, no, wait, that was a police chopper, circled, its downdraft ruffling the leaves on the trees and, much to my amusement, severely disarraying Agnes's helmet of hair. For the first time, a flicker of something other than triumph crossed her face. Perhaps a tiny seed of doubt that this might be a tad excessive? I decided it was time to make my appearance. I calmly walked to my front door, unlocked the perfectly functioning "thank you very much" deadbolt, and opened it. Agnes, who was in the process of dramatically pointing towards my house for the benefit of a rather stern-looking police sergeant approaching her, actually jumped back as if I'd materialized out of thin air. "There he is, officer, that's the man. He's dangerous," she shrieked, her voice now laced with genuine panic as the sheer scale of the response she'd invoked began to dawn on her. The sergeant, a tall, weary-looking man with Sergeant Miller on his name tag, gave me a long, appraising look, then turned his gaze back to Agnes, then to the assembled emergency vehicles, then back to me. I could almost see the cogs turning in his head. Highly agitated woman in a yellow pantsuit claiming imminent danger versus Plas. Calm older gentleman in a cardigan opening his own front door. I simply stood there, hands visible, a neutral expression on my face. "Good morning, Sergeant," I said, my voice even. Quite a commotion. "Is there something I can help you with?" Sergeant Miller held up a hand to silence Agnes, who was still sputtering about barricades and hostile intent. "Sir." He said to me, "We received a 911 call reporting a potential hostage situation, a barricaded subject, possibly armed and dangerous, and a request for an airlift and special assistance." The caller, this lady here, he gestured towards Agnes, identified herself as the HOA president and claimed you were refusing her lawful entry and posing a significant threat. I nodded slowly. "Ah, yes. Miss Periwinkle, our HOA president." She was attempting to gain entry to my private residence using a so-called HOA master key, which, as far as I'm aware, has no legal standing. When her key, unsurprisingly, didn't work on my high-security lock, she appears to have become somewhat agitated. I kept my tone matter-of-fact, deliberately avoiding any hint of sarcasm, though it was sorely tempting. Agnes, meanwhile, was aghast. "It's not so-called. It's an official HOA key. He's lying. He's trying to trick you, Sergeant." Miller looked at her. "Ma'am, did you actually see any weapons? Did he threaten you verbally or physically before you called 911? Agnes hesitated. Her eyes darted from me to the sergeant. The lie was becoming harder to sustain face-to-face with actual authority. "Well, no, not exactly, but he's very resistant. And his refusal to allow an HOA inspection is deeply suspicious. He could have anything in there. He locked himself in." "He's in his own home, ma'am," Sergeant Miller said, his voice developing a distinct edge of impatience. "People are generally allowed to be in their own homes, locked or otherwise." He turned back to me. "Sir, do you have any objections to us just taking a quick look around to verify there's no immediate emergency, just to satisfy procedural requirements given the nature of the call?" "Not at all, Sergeant," I replied. "Please, come in. You'll find I was just in my office, working. My son, Mark Davies, is actually one of your dispatchers. He might have even taken the call. Perhaps you know him?" At the mention of Mark's name, "Sergeant?" Miller's eyebrows shot up. "Mark Davies? Yeah, good kid, sharp. So, he took this call?" He glanced at Agnes again, and this time, his expression was one of dawning comprehension and profound irritation. The pieces were clicking into place for him. The dangerous barricaded subject was the father of one of his own dispatchers. The hostage situation was a man drinking coffee in his study. The request for an airlift was looking more and more like a monumental waste of taxpayer money and emergency resources. While two officers did a quick, professional walkthrough of my house, confirming, to no one's surprise but Agnes's apparent continued suspicion, that I was not, in fact, running a secret militia training camp or holding mythical hostages, I calmly explained the situation to Sergeant Miller on my porch. I outlined the history of Agnes's Master Key initiative, my formal refusal based on legal grounds, and her subsequent campaign of minor harassments. Crucially, I then said, "Sergeant, if you'll just give me one moment." I went back inside and returned with a tablet. "This is footage from my front door security camera, time-stamped from about 30 minutes ago." Growing increasingly frustrated, then making the dramatic 911 call, the audio was clear enough to catch her increasingly wild claims. Sergeant Miller watched, his expression growing stonier by the second. The other officers, their walkthrough complete and finding nothing amiss, gathered to watch over his shoulder. The fire crews and ambulance personnel, sensing the situation was not what it had been reported to be, were starting to look visibly annoyed at being dragged out for what was clearly a farce. When the video ended, showing Agnes triumphantly hanging up after demanding special forces, Sergeant Miller slowly turned to her. The air crackled. Even the helicopter seemed to quiet down as if holding its breath. "Miss Periwinkle," he began, his voice dangerously low and controlled. "Making a false police report is a serious offense. Misusing emergency services, fabricating a story that ties up multiple units including air support, fire, and EMS, carries significant penalties. Based on what I've just seen and heard, and the complete lack of any evidence to support your claims of imminent danger, barricades, or weapons, I'm having a very hard time understanding your actions this morning." Agnes had gone from pearl white to a sort of mottled gray. The canary yellow pantsuit suddenly looked garish and absurd. But he wouldn't let me in. It's HOA policy. I am the president," she stammered, her bravado utterly deflated, replaced by a dawning panic. "Ma'am," Sergeant Miller said, taking a step closer, "your HOA policies do not supersede state law, nor do they give you the right to fabricate emergencies. You knowingly made false statements to a 911 dispatcher. My officer confirmed it was indeed your voice from a recording of the call, alleging a life-threatening situation that simply did not exist. This entire response," he gestured broadly at the assembled forces, "is a direct result of your false claims." He then turned to one of his officers. "Officer Jones, please read Miss Brace, Reese's of Axe. Periwinkle her Miranda rights. She's being placed under arrest for making a false report and misuse of emergency services." The satisfying click of handcuffs ratcheting shut was, I confess, music to my ears. Agnes Periwinkle, steward of community standards, was finally facing actual standards, the legal kind. And my son, the dispatcher who had professionally and then dutifully handled her madness, had just set in motion a chain of events that would bring her reign to a spectacular and very public end. The aftermath of Agnes Periwinkle's dramatic arrest on my front lawn was, to put it mildly, the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. As the police cruiser pulled away, with Agnes staring blankly out the back window, her canary-yellow pantsuit now looking decidedly rumpled and her silver hair askew, a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to even make eye contact were suddenly emerging from their homes, blinking in the sunlight like startled meerkats, a mixture of disbelief and dawning elation on their faces. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, actually did a little jig on her driveway. Sergeant Miller, after taking my detailed statement and copies of my video evidence and HOA correspondence, shook my hand. "Mr. Davies," he said with a hint of a weary smile, "your son Mark is a good dispatcher. He handled that call by the book, especially once the claims became extreme. She really dug her own hole here. We'll be in touch regarding the charges." He also mentioned that the county would likely be looking to recoup the costs of the unnecessary deployment from misplace. "We'll be in touch regarding the charges. From as a data verit. Periwinkle, which, given the helicopter, multiple police units, fire trucks, and ambulance, was going to be a substantial sum. That alone, I thought, would be a bitter pill for her to swallow, quite apart from the criminal charges. The investigation that followed was thorough. My video evidence of her attempting to use the master key and her subsequent hysterical 911 call was, of course, Exhibit A. But what her arrest triggered was something larger. With Agnes temporarily out of commission and her authority shattered, other residents began to come forward with their own stories of her overreach, harassment, and questionable decisions as HOA president. It turned out that her Master Key initiative was just the tip of the iceberg. There were allegations of financial irregularities in the HOA accounts, contracts awarded to friends without proper bidding, and a general pattern of using the HOA as her personal piggy bank and power base. The police, initially focused on the false 911 call, soon found themselves with a much wider inquiry on their hands. My meticulous records, originally intended to protect myself, became a valuable resource for them in understanding the timeline and scope of Agnes's misdeeds. The two remaining board members, Arthur Jenkins and Brenda Riley, found themselves under scrutiny as well. Arthur, predictably, cooperated fully, providing investigators with whatever information he had, likely trying to save his own skin. Brenda, Agnes's loyal sycophant, initially tried to stonewall, but faced with the mounting evidence and the prospect of potential complicity charges, she too began to sing. The charge sheet against Agnes grew. It started with making a false police report and misuse of emergency services. But as the financial investigation deepened, charges of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty were added. It appeared that Agnes had been systematically siphoning funds from the HOA reserves for years, using them for personal expenses, lavish trips disguised as HOA research, and even payments to the out-of-town locksmith who had agreed to her master key scheme, a locksmith who, it turned out, was a distant cousin with a rather shady reputation. Her attempt to gain access to my house, it was speculated, might have been driven by a desperate need to find or silence something, or perhaps simply an arrogant assertion of power that she felt was slipping away as residents grew more discontented. The master key, it turned out, wasn't just about inspections, it was about control and, potentially, covering her tracks. The sheer audacity of calling 911 with such outlandish claims was perhaps a sign of her increasing desperation and detachment from reality. My son, Mark, was initially a little worried about any professional repercussions for his handling of the call, but his supervisors, after reviewing the tapes and Sergeant Miller's report, commended him. He had followed protocol meticulously. He'd initially tried to de-escalate and clarify, and when Agnes's claims reached a critical threshold of alleged danger, he had dispatched the appropriate level of response based on her words. The responsibility for the massive deployment and its subsequent cost lay squarely with Agnes. In fact, Mark's professionalism under duress became something of a minor legend at the dispatch center. The guy whose dad was accused of needing an airlift by the crazy HOA lady, he took it in stride, though he did admit to me later, "Dad, when she started screaming about special forces, I knew she was toast. No one makes claims like that without expecting a serious response. I just had to make sure I did my job right so she couldn't wriggle out of it." And he had. His calm adherence to procedure, in the face of his own mother's bizarre fiction, was instrumental in ensuring justice was served. The legal proceedings against Agnes Periwinkle dragged on for months. She hired a high-powered lawyer who tried every trick in the book: claims of emotional distress, arguments that she was acting in good faith for the community, even attempts to discredit me and other residents. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video footage was irrefutable. The financial records painted a clear picture of theft and deception. And the sheer, unadulterated lunacy of her 911 call, played in court, left the jury members visibly stunned, some even struggling to suppress laughter at the airlift request before quickly schooling their features. I was called to testify, as were several other residents, Sergeant Miller, and even Mark, who calmly recounted the details of the 911 call from his professional perspective as a dispatcher. Throughout the trial, Agnes maintained an air of injured innocence. Her expensive, though now less pristine, outfits a stark contrast to the grim reality of her situation. She still seemed to believe, right up until the verdict, that she was the victim, a dedicated community servant unfairly persecuted for trying to uphold standards. The jury, however, saw it differently. They found her guilty on multiple counts: felony, making a false report to emergency services, elevated to a felony due to the scale of the resources wasted and the nature of the false claims of immediate danger, multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. The sentencing was the final act in this suburban drama. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime and abuse of trust, was scathing in her summary. She spoke of the profound breach of trust Agnes had committed against her neighbors, the taxpayers whose money she had wasted with her false alarm, and the emergency services personnel she had endangered by diverting them from potential real crises. She highlighted the calculated nature of the financial crimes and the arrogance inherent in the master key debacle and the subsequent 911 call. When the sentence was handed down, 5 years in state prison plus significant restitution to the HOA and the county for the emergency response costs, a gasp went through the courtroom. Agnes visibly sagged, all pretense of composure gone. Her lawyer looked crestfallen. For me, it wasn't a moment of triumph or revenge exactly. It was a moment of profound, weary relief. Justice, often slow and cumbersome, had finally been served. The 5-year sentence was a result of the totality of her actions. The felony false reporting was serious enough, but combined with years of systematic embezzlement and fraud, it painted a picture of a serial abuser of power and trust. The 911 call was merely the catalyst that brought her entire house of cards crashing down. In the end, Agnes Periwinkle's reign of terror ended not with a whimper but with the clang of a prison door. The neighborhood underwent a kind of renaissance. A new HOA board was elected, composed of reasonable, community-minded individuals, including, to my surprise, Mrs. Gable, who found a new lease on life. The ridiculous rules were rescinded. The finances were put back in order, The atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by one of cooperation and neighborliness. People started planting colorful flowers again. Wind chimes tinkled merrily, and lawn gnomes, in a defiant celebration of kitsch, made a triumphant return. My life returned to its peaceful, semi-retired rhythm, though I did gain a certain notoriety as the guy who took down the HOA Karen. Mark continued his career as a dispatcher, earning a promotion not long after. His reputation for calm competence further solidified. We sometimes joke about the airlift incident. But beneath the humor is a serious lesson about the abuse of power, however petty its initial scope, and the importance of standing up for one's rights, methodically and with irrefutable evidence. Agnes Periwinkle wanted a master key to our homes. Instead, her own actions provided the key that unlocked her downfall, leading to her conviction and a 5-year lesson in humility. And it all started because she just couldn't comprehend that some doors, and some people, simply won't be bullied open. So, what do you think? Craziest HOA story ever? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to hear if anyone can top the airlift Karen. And if you made it this far, thanks for listening to my tale of suburban warfare and ultimate vindication.